Okay, we are live. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. This is the Season 2 opener, and we're doing something a little different, as you can tell. You're either listening to this as a podcast, in which case we're just coming into your ears, or, and this works, we've got a video, and it's on YouTube, and you are looking at our beautiful, beautiful faces. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by my great friend and good co-host, Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? I'm assuming that's going to be a full kaiju response throughout the entire episode.
I know no words.
We are going to be covering, I don't know if it's been announced, we've been putting all this out there, but we're going back as always for Season 2. We've got all these films we're going to cover. And I noticed something today, just looking at what we've got in the pipeline for Series 2. And we are starting at the very beginning with 1954 with the Japanese movie Godzilla, or Gojira, as it's called. But one of the things I noticed, really, and I was just sort of looking at the videos, and I've got them up here in front of me, which you can't really see, but is this appears to be really like, it's our cult movie season, this one. I was just looking through and I was like, okay, we've got Godzilla, and I think, just off air, you sort of mentioned that you've seen some Godzilla films, but not really seen this one, and then you've got other coming down the pipeline. You've got Barbarella, Rocky Horror Picture Show, Videodrome, Mars Attacks, John Carter, Dread, Valerian. All those are sort of like full-on proper cult films these days. So some really good obscure stuff this year. So this season's going to be cracking.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about them as cult films, but I had thought about them as just stuff that was fun. And I suffer from depression. I'm on medication for it. And, I remember when we were putting this together, I thought, let's do some fun stuff. Like, my gut instinct is always like, let's go to, Stanley Kubrick. Let's go to, some obscure French stuff, Yeah. But I thought, oh, hell with it, let's do Barbarella and Mars Attacks. And, I think we were kind of on the same page and vibing in the same direction there.
Oh, yeah. No, I keep looking at this list we've got for this series, and I'm really looking forward to it. There's some great stuff. And kicking off with Godzilla from 1954 as well, Godzilla's been rebooted a number of times of late. The Japanese released Shin Godzilla in 2017. In 2016, the American Godzilla came out, and then you had more recently Godzilla King of Monsters. So he's back in the mainstream, really. But Britain and America and Japan obviously have very different relationships with this sort of the kaiju and that sort of thing. But as an American, sort of like, Julian, what's your take on Godzilla? Because he seems quite big over there, as a character.
Well, I mean, we like mass destruction. Hollywood is not known for its subtle messages. So, we like shit to blow up. We're the home of Michael Bay. Mm-hmm. So, Godzilla is kind of right up our alley, I think, in that respect. And plus, we also love, there's been my entire life, there's been a kind of like fetishization of Japan. And, I remember in the old days, we've talked about like Akira, how, we had to like get anime on, VHS tapes and, had to track this stuff down. And, it was like this whole other world. And I think that anything Japanese, especially, was sort of beloved. And if it was a little weird, it was charmingly weird to Americans. So I think that plays into it, too. What about Britain?
Yeah, never really. I mean, Godzilla didn't cross my radar until I was in my 20s, really. I think... Well, actually, no, the first time Godzilla really crossed my radar was the American remake, the Matthew Broderick one.
Classic.
Oh yeah. That's what cinemas were made for. I remember watching it thinking, this isn't a bad film. This is quite good fun. And then, digging, as I always do, doing a little bit of research, there's like 30 odd other films that in the Toho sort of back catalogue, and they're all variety of things from weirdly comic, comedic, through to quite serious. And it coming back to this film, but no, he has like no real presence in the culture over here. Like he doesn't, it doesn't land really. probably more so now with the new Godzilla. But for me, yeah, it's always been. In fact, I tell you, I couldn't go to like Amazon.co.uk, or I couldn't go to HMV. I could not pick up Godzilla on Blu-ray or DVD in this country. You can't.
Really?
You cannot get the Toho films on Blu-ray. You can. The Criterion did a release recently, didn't they? Like a big box set of the Showa era stuff. That's the first time that it has been released on physical media in this country. The BFI released this film, which is what I've got for the original, and then I've got the American versions. And then Shin Godzilla got released, but I've got like a German version of the 1985 one, which I just picked up sort of by accident. But yeah, other than that, I've had to sort of find them online on different ways, and they're starting to appear in sort of like odd ways on Amazon. Amazon Prime's got a couple now. I'm not sure they're the legit ones though. They may not be there very long. But yeah, it just doesn't seem to have much of a presence over here. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I don't know that Godzilla is sort of beloved over here. I mean, I think that when we've done those, like I remember the Broderick one, it was kind of like Godzilla is something that everybody knows, but I don't know how much people ever liked. I think that, the Broderick one was sort of like, okay, everybody knows this, so, let's throw a bunch of money at it and see if we can't make a blockbuster. And it was sort of like post-Jurassic Park, so they, obviously it's got those tiny Godzillas, so the whole second half is basically Jurassic Park in New York. So they were kind of hedging their bets a little there. But I think that, like Godzilla has name recognition, but I don't know how much, anyone knows about Godzilla or is really a fan. Having said that, I mean, I remember basically like grew up on Godzilla. I mean, there were Godzilla movies on TV, and they were always sort of like random, movies. I remember, Mechagodzilla and Mothra, and now like I guess it's we have a channel Comet over here that I watch a lot. That's like a sci-fi channel, and they play sort of the cheap stuff, right? They play the stuff that doesn't cost a lot of money to license. So, and they play a lot of Godzilla stuff, and it's random stuff. It's like, Mechagodzilla, and, you see a lot of that stuff. So growing up, I mean, there was a kind of fun of just kind of making lists of sort of like, hey, what weird other kaiju do you know about?
Yeah, it's odd because it's definitely seems to be taking. It's growing, and like you say, it's not something that's been over here, but I've seen it on. It seems to be appearing a little bit on Amazon Prime. I recently watched Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla, or the Cosmic Monster, and then there's a sequel to that which I watched. Both fine, but like you say, really sort of like low budget kind of fare. And because some of this is still new to me, especially the older stuff, the 60s and 70s stuff, like, it's got these weird sort of sci-fi subplots, and then these guys in suits running around sort of beating the crap out of each other. It reminds me more of like the 90s Power Rangers than anything else. And obviously that sort of seems to be where it comes from. I think that's where Power Rangers has clearly got that origin. But I'm watching it going like, yeah, maybe it just didn't reach. I didn't reach it at the right age. If I'd have watched this as a kid or so, it probably would have been like, this is amazing. I'm watching now and I'm thinking like, yeah, it's not that good. Some of it's the ones where Godzilla is a destroyer, like a destructor, like like the original, the 85 one, and some of them are modern. I prefer those to sort of Godzilla versus something. I find those a bit daft.
No, I agree. I mean, I think those are sillier, and I think that I always think of like how in comics everyone gets their multiple versions of themselves, right? Like you start with Batman, and then you get Robin, and pretty soon you got Catwoman, and then you've got like this Batman and that Batman, and there's Superman, and then there's Supergirl, and then there's Bizarro, and you just get these multiple versions. And after a while, a franchise that kind of does that just increasingly gets into kind of silly territory. And the original novelty of like, there's a guy who can fly from Krypton is sort of like, yeah, that's not really where it's at anymore. It's more like you've got to accept this whole family of monsters in the case of Godzilla. And so, yeah, I mean, I think those are sillier. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the 54 film, I'm glad that, you made me watch it, is because it doesn't have any of that. I mean, it's much more a kind of classic monster movie that does not presume that you're already on board with Godzilla, and so we can just introduce a Mecha Godzilla in the first 20 minutes and just have them fight.
Yeah, I think the thing, I mean, I had watched this before, but because I'd dipped into those other ones, like I'd forgotten the tone of this film. And that was the thing that struck me first. Like, those other ones are very, they've got very sci-fi elements, or they've got like a spy plot or something else, or there's a journalist trying to investigate something, and they've got those sort of more adventure elements, sort of like, boys, almost like a boy's own adventure kind of stuff, and then Godzilla on top of that. This is a really somber film. Like, there are moments in this film, like, where I was quietly taken aback watching it. I'm like, oh yeah, no, they really are making a statement with this film. Like, this isn't a fun romp. This is set out to say something. And so, yeah, it kind of struck me really that was the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I like least about this film is the whole oxygen bomb nonsense that's used to kill Godzilla, which is so stupid and such a sort of like an element that one would expect from those 70s sort of silly sci-fi stuff. I mean, so that is there, but the stuff, I mean, the scenes of devastation, especially after the main Godzilla attack, I won't say climactic because it's not really the climax. It's the worst attack, kind of, 2/3 of the way through, is there. And it's so obviously a reference to World War II. I mean, the shadow of World War II hangs over this so strongly. And I think that my whole life, it's like there are the conventional interpretations of things, right? So like, if anyone mentions Invasion of the Body Snatchers, people, instantly think, oh, well, that's communism, right? Yeah. Think about it. Ha ha, this is standard interpretation. Godzilla, well, it's Hiroshima, think about it, and that is really absolutely clear in this. It's not hidden at all. And it really is a film that is wrestling with World War II. And I think ultimately, I have a theory about this. I think ultimately wrestling with World War II, but also exonerating Japan in a way that is troubling.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a minute, because there was something, I'll be interested in what you say, because I agree to an extent in an odd way. And I find that there's a character called Shirazawa, the scientist, and he sort of seems to act as that in that way, and provide some of those sort of statements of intent. And just to give for instance, there's one where he's been interviewed. There's a journalist trying to interview him about certain things, and he says he has this oxygen destroyer, bomb or device, whatever. Which, like you say, it's rather silly, but when the journalist says, "Oh, here you've got this thing, and I heard it from this guy, and I heard it who's got who's got your German friend," and he makes out straight away, he's like, "I have no German friends." And it's like, even in the film though, they're trying to distance themselves of no, that's not us anymore. And so, yeah, that really sort of struck out at me. Like, that sounds like a really weird comment, but in the context of what this film's trying to say, it's like, it's Japan saying, no, we're not connected with them anymore. Like, that's not us. I think the other thing,
that's a really good catch.
Yeah, I think one of the things I looked into off the back of this was how long was American occupation of Japan. The Americans didn't leave officially until 1952, so this came out 2 years after American occupation. And that sort of seems to sort of be there as well. I think in a little, I get hints of it in a weird way, but there's a lot to talk about in some of these films. But before we do, we just want to say that so we've got, it was released in 1954, re-released in America in 1956, with the heavily edited and other scenes edited. We won't be talking about that. It was directed by Ishiro Honda, written by Takeo Murata. I'm going to butcher some of these names. Murata. It stars Takashi Shimura. bloody hell, Akiko Kurata, Akira Takarada, Momoko Koki, and Fuyuki Murakami. They were the main guys. I just wanted to sort of get that in, really. But just that's the main cast. I'm not even going to go to the plot because it's the main thing. But you say about the I'll let you get into your theory first. Because there were some awesome things that popped out to me. But what's your theory about Japan trying to exonerate itself in this through this film?
Well, I mean, I've done some read history books on Japan, and one of the primary things I think it's important to understand about sort of post-war Japan is a kind of reinvention of Japan. That, in the same way that once Japan opened itself up to commerce, it reinvented itself. I mean, the emperor was not always divine, this is believed to, have gone back to ancient times. It's not at all. This is all sort of myth making. And one of the key aspects of Japanese national myth making in the post-war period is this idea of Japan as having somehow always been peaceful. Right. That, Japan was this peaceful nation that, and it's true. It's inscribed in the post-war constitution imposed by America. Yeah. Right. I mean, this is, so, and that gets you into the whole thing of outward pressure. And, there's this myth that, Japan, even among a lot of Japanese, that Japan is only capable of changing course in response to outside pressure. But for me, this movie opens outside of Tokyo, right? It opens on Odo Island, right? Which is a totally pastoral fishing village, right? It reminded me of Rossellini's Stromboli, these primitive people, they're just fishing. Yeah. And it's beautiful, but it's just this is not at all, this is an idyllic sort of innocent depiction of Japan. And it's not that those people didn't exist, but those people were told, die for the emperor, right? The Americans are coming, grab a knife, butcher your elderly parents, and kill everybody who lands. Now, the average Japanese obviously did not do that, did not follow the emperor. But, the reality is that this is a kind of wallpapering over of, any kind of Japanese militarism is just totally non-existent. And then when you get to Tokyo and the monsters attack, again, there's a clear, Tokyo's burning. It's very dramatic. This is obviously a kind of reference to the Allied and American bombing raids, which were war crimes and basically burned down every major Japanese city to the ground. And, was traumatic for the Japanese, and understandably so. And then you have, sort of the atomic bomb references. And so, one of the most impression-making scenes is, a scientist holding a Geiger counter to a small child. And it's heartbreaking, and it really does not pull any punches. But again, this is this depiction of Japan, why did they bomb us? We were this peaceful fishing people, and then we had this terrible devastation visited upon us. And so in the same way that, I think a lot of times Japan's obvious military aggressiveness, during the war is papered over, and instead we get an emphasis on, Japan as victim, which, to be fair, was a victim. Again, the cities were destroyed in firebomb raids. But talk to the Koreans or the Chinese about this idea of a peaceful Japan in World War II. No,
that's really interesting about them. Because again, it was, as you say, the constitution that was forced on them or created for them by the Americans. It says it removed their right to wage war, didn't it? So that was sort of became sort of the one of their things. I totally agree with this idea of becoming the victim. It's this idea that sort of because I was in watching it, and everyone's, as you said, sort of, think Godzilla represents the H bomb and all this other stuff. And I almost think that's too much of a simplification. That really, like you say, there's a scene in during the devastation. You've got the people running around, and it's the miniatures are actually pretty good in this. The city's burning. You have the silhouette of Godzilla, sort of like roaring, that recognizable roar, and the flames. It looks great, but it's more than the H bomb, isn't it? It's that fear. For Godzilla, to me, is more a fear of outside. That outside pressure, the outside destruction. It's whatever. It's not just the H bomb, it's everything. Godzilla's this monster, this sort of the outside world will come in and it will batter us, and it will and it always felt more to me than the H bomb. And there's a weird thing in this film about the duality, almost like the old versus the new, that keeps cropping up. Like because you say about this fishing village, it's sort of the first place that they go to. It's also the first place that you get to meet Godzilla on Odo Island. And the three things that really popped up to me was the first time he attacked. You don't see Godzilla for ages. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll get onto it. The first reveal of Godzilla is bizarre. You wouldn't do it in a modern movie. Like he literally just pops his head over a hill, like sort of peekaboo.
Yeah. But it does look cool, right? I mean,
yeah. It gives you that idea of size, But the thing, like when you see the first, I think it's meant to be his first attack. It's depicted as like a natural disaster, like it's accompanied by a storm. You see things being blown over, and you don't really see Godzilla, but you know that he's part of the destruction. So there's this sort of duality of like a natural disaster paired with this creature that's accidentally created by science. And then later, there's an old rural man on the beach, like the old farmer, the old dude who sort of sits there, and he's the one who names it Godzilla. And it's meant to be like some Japanese legend. It's sort of out of these things, and it's so good. It's so King Kong because he says, "Oh well, we're gonna have to sacrifice the virgin to it because this is what happens. It's what we used to do." And I'm thinking, how you're not that old? How long ago was this? But then that's obviously paired with all the scientists turn up with all the technology. So there's this real duality of old versus new. And it seems to come to a head. There's a scene, it's just like a public debate scene, or it's almost like a parliament or something. And there's all these like stuffy guys in suits. And then these are angry women saying, you've got to tell the public. It's fact. We've got to be just honest and truthful. And then these guys in suits are going, no, shut up. He literally tells us to shut up. And he's like, you can't do that. It'll cause panic, all this other stuff. And there does seem to be this sort of rocking back and forth for Japan of the old versus the new. And like, where do we sit in this? Like, I don't know where, as a country. And that seems to just keep popping up throughout the film.
Well, and I think that reflects, this sort of post-war period that is kind of taking stock of Japanese traditions. But at the same time, very much aware that it's in a sort of, post-atomic world and painfully aware. I mean, we had a very similar debate, in my town about climate change, where, the women were saying, it's the truth. You've got to release this. And all the town elders were saying, no, people don't tell people. Science doesn't matter. But, jokes aside, I mean, I like the old man. There is this sort of, I mean, I love the first reveal of Godzilla. I mean, to me, I like it. I'm not sure that this is a great structural movie in terms of its plot, but I like the sort of slow reveal, right? I mean, I like there's this monster, but you just see part of him over the ridge, and it's like, all right, we've heard his sound, we've seen it, but, you're holding back on the full devastation until the climax. And I think that's something that I fault current movies for, that, if this, every movie's got to start with the big devastation, right? To give you that gut punch. And, so, I mean, if this were made today, I mean, it starts with a terrible scene, where you just see Godzilla full on, he demolishes stuff, it's got to start with an action sequence. And I think this sort of like slow reveal is really good. I do think that, among the things that don't make sense, you're right that, there's this sort of the coast battered by the storm. And in that testimony, they a Japanese man says, this was not a normal hurricane, and somebody says like, it was an animal. It's like, how did you not see this? Yeah. Right. And there's even a shot where you see the sort of fishing village and you see the coast, and you can see this sort of like, cheap special effect is sort of like a white light in the water. And you can see it from the coast. Yeah. So it's like, if these fishing vessels, have been sunk by this monster, and, you could see that monster from the shore, right?
Yeah. Well, it just happened because you say about the opening. I do say there are a couple of moments where, like I say, structurally it's not great because it sort of repeats itself, doesn't it? It's sort of like the opening scene is I think it's meant to be a military ship or of some kind, and they get attacked, but you never see quite. You just see a flash of light, and then you just see the ship burning and that sort of thing. And again, I think this sort of goes back to the iconography of the bomb, isn't it? The great flash and then just the devastation. And so you see the ship going. So I think that you're almost meant to think that, they make that association. And then they basically send out another ship and it goes, same thing. Well, because even the people are asking, like, well, why have you just sent this other ship or these two other ships? The same things happened. And so, the first sort of like 15 minutes or so of this film, they're a little bit odd because it just sort of the pacing seems, or what they decide to do is a bit bizarre. But I like the fact there is a mystery. They save some of the sailors, they bring them back, and they're clearly sort of like affected by it. They're injured and this other stuff. Like, and there is this thing at one point. There's a scene where I don't know if it's like the Prime Minister or whoever like says, really, we've only saved 3 people. Like, this is not good. Like, there's an acknowledgement that it's a bit of a cock up. And so at no point are they like, look, this is a monster sort of ripping people apart. Like, there's an acknowledgement like, look, this doesn't look good. Like, we have to do something more. So this film's constantly populated by these debates of like, how should we approach this? And they seem to become more decisive. I mean, I'm surprised there's no decision later on about or debate about whether or not they should evacuate, because that's the thing now, isn't it? If you have an American film or even a modern Japanese film, there'd be a scene where they're like, we can't evacuate the city, or we should evacuate the city, but that's not really mentioned in this. There's literally a scene where they're like, right, we're going to evacuate this massive area, and everyone's like, all right, we'll do that.
Well, I mean, a couple things come to mind about what you're saying. I mean, one is that I think there's this kind of divide between, obviously, sort of Tokyo at the end and Odo Island early on. And I think that sometimes in America, we, or in the West, we imagine Japan as one unified culture. And the reality is, Japan is an archipelago, and, there are plenty of islands that have subcultures, and that some of the subcultures are discriminated against and seen as sort of backwards, primitive, not fully Japanese. Japanese culture is complex and heterogeneous. And I think that there is that kind of like urban-rural split that you see early on. And so, like, at the same time that the Japanese are depicted as victims in this movie, the movie is also making fun of, like, on that island, there could be, an old man who's like, we used to sacrifice virgins to it, Yeah,
it does seem like they say Japan seems to have sort of like, and that's what I say about the duality. Like, from a cultural standpoint, there's clearly this sort of, the government in the middle, the scientists who are educated, they're well funded, they've clearly got the right technology, and then these sort of like, hick fishermen living on this island that at one point you literally see people running towards Godzilla with samurai swords and like sticks. They've got staffs and stuff, and you're thinking like, it's not going to do much. I don't think. And then you get the reveal. So there's clearly this sort of, almost, I don't know. I don't know the director's sort of stance on this, but it's almost like a poking fun at the old, isn't it? That sort of, you still believe these ridiculous ideas, or you still think that cultural thing is relevant or whatever, when it's not. So yeah, it's definitely an odd film. I don't know whether it's sort of pro Japan or not in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it wants to be, but I mean, I think that you can be a work of Japanese nationalist propaganda and still, and still mock the outer islands and mock, these sort of subcultures. I mean, I think that is contained within a kind of Japanese nationalism. I mean, the other thing that you're talking about like government, I think it's amazing the utter lack of government in this film. I mean, you see this nice sort of like town council, and the sort of peasant women are saying, "No, we demand the truth." That sounds pretty heroic, but you just hear the cities are being evacuated. The main protagonists of authority are scientists, right? So again, this is kind of like, like you don't see the emperor. I mean, you see like some Japanese military, there's tanks and stuff, but like if this were a present day American film, right, this would be entirely focused on, the brave generals, who are taking on Godzilla. The generals are not important here. And I think this is also part of sort of Japanese myth making, to sort of see like, well, we are ambivalent about science. I think there's a kind of like Frankenstein-like ambivalence about science and the dangers of the bomb. But there is this sort of national myth making, I think, going on in which Japanese, or in which Japan is seen as a principally not just peaceful, but also a scientific nation. That excels in the sciences, and so the authorities are kind of scientists more than military people.
Yeah, that's true. Because again, like I say, the main characters they are scientists, aren't they? And they're shown to be, noble and making the right decisions and in asking some difficult questions. But yeah, at no point are they really of any authority. I mean, the scientist who comes up with the oxygen destroyer, Shirazawa, like he's got it in his basement. Like that appears to be his lab. Like it's a home lab in his basement. And all I could think about more was like, have you seen like the Vincent Price The Fly, like the original in that?
No, I have not. When we did The Fly, I revealed I have not seen this.
It's very similar. It's this notion of, I think, obviously to reduce the number of sets and all this other stuff. But there seems to be this notion in the 50s of these scientists who have got these sort of like extravagant and incredibly dangerous experiments just in their house. It's just there. And
you don't, Scott?
Yeah.
I mean, my basement looks exactly like that.
Loaded with electrodes and bubbling pots and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they're right next to the Transformers.
I just find it hilarious, like you say, because there's in the modern thing now there's sort of like you'd go to some sort of government body and there'd be the reference to like the CDC or some whatever other government body looks after this, the Environmental Protection Agency or something. But with this, it's just like, this scientist has come up with this thing to destroy that could kill, and they're all like, all right, well, we shall use that. And whilst I really like the character of Shirazawa, I do find it bizarre that the only person that turns up to question him is a journalist who's heard about him, and then these two other people. Like, there's no one from the military or the government knocking on his door saying, "We've got this national emergency. We hear you might be able to help."
Yeah, I mean, there's a strange kind of disconnect there, right? Yeah. Where there are not these national figures that are important characters. And I was thinking, like, as we were talking of how the military and the government is at this, simultaneously sort of invisible in this film. You kind of hear what they're doing as sort of like edicts, right? We're evacuating the city, but they're never depicted as characters, right? They're just faceless. And then secondarily, utterly incompetent. So I was thinking of like, well, we do see the military, and we see them not just in the beginning, kind of with the ships vanishing, but one of their first plans to address Godzilla is to drop death charges.
Yeah.
Not going to help.
Yeah.
Like if you've seen any Godzilla movie, you're like, no, that's probably going to piss him off. Not a good idea. And then they have this, the government has this ridiculous plan that it's certainly one of the most ridiculous things. Like, well, after it's clear it's Godzilla, the way we're going to protect the population is to set up an electric fence along the border with the ocean, right? Along the coastline of basically like a third of Japan, And, this is one of the worst special effects in the film, where they've taken basically electric power towers and just superimposed them over the coastline. And you think, electric power towers are not the same thing as an electric fence, but, close enough if you add electrical effects. But again, Godzilla is not phased. I mean, he does not even seem wounded by this electricity. He just demolishes them. So there's this way in which government is both invisible but also incompetent.
Yeah, they do. They seem to be like a hurdle at every point, because, like you say, that they have these moments of trying to do things, and then I say it doesn't work, and they'll just sort of stumble onto the next. But even the military, when they're trying to prevent people from coming into into Tokyo, the scientists run up to them, and their response to be like, "We can't let you in. It's too dangerous. You can't go in." They're like, "But we're scientists." There's no explanation to like what that means. It's just like, we're scientists. You have to let us in. And the soldiers are a bit like, all right. And he ums and ahs, and they end up getting past. It's just it does seem a bit sort of they do definitely seem ineffectual, I think, throughout.
Right. And I also find myself wondering, like, what do they know about these scientists? Like, there's this odd kind of, like, for example, screw up his name, but the scientist with the eye patch, Surizawa, yes. The entire plot depends on him swearing Emiko to, who I found quite the star character for me. But, he has her swear to secrecy about what he's developing, in this oxygen destroyer thing. And then as soon as they've decided to use it, he's being interviewed by journalists about the oxygen destroyer, and they clearly know absolutely everything. And he says, like, well, yeah, I'll use this to stop Godzilla, but the world must never know. And then the very next scene, it's like the entire world knows.
It's on the news.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's similar to what you're saying about sort of like, what is the relationship between these scientists and the press and the military or the government?
Yeah, it's really sort of unclear, like, where everything sits. And, to be fair, it doesn't impact on the story or anything, but it is really funny. Like you say, he's sort of swearing her to sort of secrecy. She tells one person, he's then interviewed. All of a sudden, like I say, it's on like headline news across the world. We've got this oxygen destroying device, and it's going to stop Godzilla. And it is. I mean, it's there for plot purposes. But again, it's sort of like it doesn't make a great deal of sense. Surizawa, though, is an interesting character, and he's used in an interesting way. Like, his eye patch is clearly an indication. I can't remember if they actually mentioned it, but it's clearly an indication of, he's a holdover from the war in some way. Or, but there's a scene where he's talking about the oxygen destroyer, and he says like, I created it almost by accident. The world cannot know about this because what happens, the government will weaponize it. Like, that's their inevitable sort of conclusion of what they shall do with this. So I can't tell anyone. And there's a moment in the scene, I'm trying to say about the notes, where he literally says, like, I have to stop this from becoming a weapon, right? And the camera's like dead on. And for about 3 or 4 seconds, it's just him looking straight at the audience. Of him saying, like, I can't let this happen, can I? Right. And I'm sort of like, this is clearly the director asking the audience, like, you're on board with it, aren't you? We cannot be responsible for unleashing, it happened to us. We cannot unleash a similar weapon on the world. And I found that quite interesting. Sort of like, is he trying to project a question onto the audience? Because he provides them with an answer, but is he trying to project that onto the audience? I don't know.
Well, and in the same way, like Serizawa, he burns his notes, right? And Miko cries, and obviously he is the heroic sacrifice of the film. I mean, he dies at the end. He sacrifices basically not necessarily his entire life's work, but his great discovery. In the interest of peace. At the same time, I'm so thrown out by the idea of burning the notes and Emiko crying. And then the very next scene is like, the press interviewing him about this thing. Like, like the rest of the world is going to be like, wait a minute, an oxygen destroyer. And if you discovered that in your basement, I'm pretty sure the Manhattan Project can duplicate, right? But I mean, we've poked a lot of fun at this movie already, but and there's stuff to laugh about. But to get to your point about him sort of looking at the camera and at the audience, I love this movie. I'm really glad that you made me watch it. And while it's easy to poke fun and there's stuff that's funny and silly, that moment can't be denied. And I think that the message of this film, as confused as it is, and as much a part of sort of Japanese national myth making as I'd argue that it is, it's still a pacifist film. And it's a film about the horrors of war. It's a film that is fundamentally, a monster movie that is humanitarian. So much of what's fun and awesome about this movie is Godzilla rampaging and terrible destruction. At the same time, those images, I mean, it's fun to see him kind of swat at missiles fired by, model jets and stuff. I mean, undeniably fun, right? And the city in flames. But that's always counterposed to these very humanitarian scenes of, there's the reporters who are in the broadcast tower that say sayonara and the tower falls. And you're like, oh, they're dead, like they died kind of heroically briefing the public, and then you have, kids, not just the radioactive kid, but you have scenes of, kids struggling. I mean, there's that mother who says to her, the Japanese wife with the two kids, who says, just a little while and we'll be with your daddy. Yeah. And it's like heartbreaking. Yeah. It's like, whoa, this is some serious stuff. And that's in the middle of a Godzilla rampage. So, it's great fun. But I mean, what you're getting at is there is a heart to this film. And as confused as it is, as much as, we can take it apart and deconstruct aspects and talk about its cultural situation, it is a pro-pacifism film. And it does depict the horrors of war, even amidst a sort of a celebration of monstrous destruction on celluloid.
Yeah, it's and this is why sort of what Godzilla became is what confuses me a little bit, because you say that's the moment, that middle section or late sort of second act section where he sort of attacks Tokyo and it's the real destruction, and the moment I say where you have the woman like hugging those children in the street and she's saying like you'll see your daddy soon, like you say, you're like, Jesus Christ. That comes out of nowhere. You're like, oh, all right, that's a bit of a gut punch. And then it's followed up, and there's literal sort of panning of the devastation. So the city is destroyed. And then it goes to the hospital, and you have that girl looking into the camera while she's being monitored with a Geiger counter, which is an obvious sort of like, reference. But then there's a moment, you've got a group of kids watching over, as their mother, I think it's their mother, is being covered over to be carried away. And the sound of a howling child in absolute grief, and it doesn't last like a couple of seconds. Like it lasts like a good 15 seconds, and I was just like, yeah, this film's not messing around. Like this section of the film is basically saying to you, again, like you say, this is why I think Godzilla is more than the bomb. It's this fear of like just something coming and battering them. It's a real fear of war in general. because there's a moment when Godzilla, when this just before the Tokyo attack happens, you have some of the main characters and they're around there. There's the older guy, and then the sort of Himiko, the young girl, and then the guy, and they hear the noise, the alarm goes off, and the old guy says, "Godzilla has come," and the way he says it is like it's just inevitable. And to me, that just says to me, this is a country that's like, look, this is. I don't know whether they're thinking like this is gonna happen again. You know, it's almost like there's an inevitability to this level of destruction. And it like I say, it's not. That's why I think this is more than just a hangover of the war. This is a hangover of sort of the American occupation and the way that they were forced into some of the cultural changes. It's just this is a representation of a country that's just had the crap kicked out of it for over a decade. It's just a bit like, I'm just tired. This is how we feel. And I just find that really, sort of say that it has got a real heart in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting thing, that line, Godzilla has come, is the one line that was retained in the porn parody. But in all seriousness, in that depiction of the real horrors of war, obviously that is not unknown to the people making this film. And I think it's something that is so missing from disaster movies, from superhero movies. I think you can thrill to the monster. You can thrill to, a superhero fight in a city. You can thrill to, an alien invasion. But it's so important to kind of ground these things in, not only are there real casualties, but they're not all just people who go down in the falling building and you say, oh, well, that's an adult man, who cares, or a noble sacrifice, a guy in his car that gets shredded by, the alien or whatever, focusing on the kids. There's a kind of like unrelenting willingness to say, there are effects of this. This is not all fun. Disaster and death and mass carnage, while it's thrilling to see on screen, means a Japanese wife with her kids. It means kids saying goodbye to their parents. It means real just heartbreak and devastation. And I think that is, a fundamental, it's so important to me that is depicted in film, and it is depicted in our fantasies. And I think, especially as an American, one of the biggest exports of my country has been Hollywood and sort of special effects blockbusters. And one of the things that I think has been most damaging to people has been, sort of the idea that, you're going to ride the blast wave, right? You're going to jump down 30 feet and, you're going to land in a superhero punch, on the ground, and you're going to be fine. And humans are just battered around in these movies. And they're always either unnamed characters who you might see die, or, somebody makes a sacrifice. But it's never heartbreaking the way it is in this movie. And people survive absurdly when they really shouldn't. And I think that, it makes us comfortable with violence and comfortable with death. And we see it in a kind of antiseptic way as a result. And this movie is so committed to not letting you have that antiseptic feeling. And I think that's noble and important.
Yeah, I totally agree. Whilst watching this, I have sort of like smushed it in with other monster movies, and I thought, to do that, I thought I'll check out some of the, the modern ones, and I watched the 1985 Godzilla, which I do kind of enjoy, but there's still that thrill of the destruction. It's still that sort of the beating of the city. And I watched Rampage, which is the sort of based on the Atari game with The Rock in it. And it's amazingly good fun. Like, it's one of the dumbest films I've ever watched. It's amazingly good fun. But there's a moment that The Rock literally gets shot in the stomach and then runs around for another 20 minutes. He fights monsters for the next 20 minutes. And I'm still thinking, like, that's what this is exactly what you're saying. Like, this invulnerability that these characters have. however, recently I've also watched a couple of like disaster movies, and there was two really. I ended up watching. Weirdly, there's films that came out parallel. I watched Volcano and Dante's Peak. I don't highly recommend either of them. They're fine. They are what they are. But there seems to be a trait, or a trope, I should say, sorry, of disaster films, which is sort of in Godzilla, these sort of like, this thing of devastation and the people and being impacted is there to tell a story. It's there to make a point of, like you said, the horrors of war. But with disaster films, it's used really to pull at your heartstrings. Like they choose a person that's going to make that heroic sacrifice. So in, spoilers for those films, but in Volcano, someone saves a bunch of people from an underground train in Los Angeles, and ends up having to jump into the lava to then throw somebody off to save them and get alive. They melt as well, which is like, that's not how lava works, but there you go.
Yeah.
And there's a similar thing in Dante's Peak where an old woman sacrifices herself to save a couple of kids, and you're like, this isn't showing. You're showing the potential impact of the disaster. You say like the horrors of war or the horror of a natural disaster, but you're doing it to pull at the audience's heartstrings rather than to say this disaster is going to mess with people and can really have an impact. And I think that's where the difference is. It's that thing they said, was it Hollywood learns the wrong lessons. Like they will look at that scene of the crying child and go, oh, that really tugged at my heartstrings. Yeah, we've got to put some of that in because the audiences love that kind of stuff. Not that that's telling the story of how the Japanese people were battered and this sort of thing, by war and everything else. It's, like you say, it's the wrong lessons seem to get learned, I think, sometimes from these films.
Yeah, I think that's poignant. I think I'm really bothered by it, and I think I have seen those two movies. I think the Volcano one is really awful. I saw that in theaters actually, but. Yeah, the other thing is, what's the ethnicity of those two noble sacrifices?
Oh, yeah, both white. One's a white male and one's a white female. So yeah,
right. I mean, so it seems to me that there's a kind of way in which that's training us to see disaster as an opportunity for heroism, and for this sort of noble sacrifice. And it occurs to me that we're recording this in the middle of a global pandemic that in my country has killed over 100,000 people and is increasing at the number one rate in the world, as well as the number one raw numbers and number one deaths per capita. And so, it occurs to me that we sometimes will say like, well, I'm willing to die, right? I'm willing to sacrifice myself. And people will take risks. They'll climb a mountain, they'll ride a motorcycle, or they'll risk dying from a disease. What we don't think about is that all of these things in life are not about somebody dying. Somebody dying isn't the worst thing. You can play with your life. You can do what you want. What's terrible is what happens to those kids. What's terrible is, a kid growing up without a father and the psychological damage that causes. People watching their loved ones die, people mourning and going through lifelong pain and lifelong trauma over what they've witnessed and the loss of their loved ones. It's not as easy as just, somebody, heroically sacrificed themselves and they died. It's all these kind of like ancillary effects. And it seems to me that Godzilla depicts that. You have these parents, you have these kids, and this is not just, a kid being squashed. It's a kid who's going to die slowly from radiation poisoning, probably over the next several months. His parents are going to watch him die. His friends are going to deal with, how do you deal with the fact that, you're 4 or 5 and you've had multiple childhood friends die slowly of radiation. I mean, it's not as simple as just somebody's died. Isn't, here's the death count, here's the heroic sacrifice. It's the full humanity. And I think that we miss that humanity, and we have trained ourselves in Hollywood to miss that humanity to the point where even where those scenes, to your point, are duplicated by Hollywood, the message is like, oh, well, just give that heart-tugging moment of sacrifice without any recognition of the underlying messy ancillary consequences of being human.
Well, it's one of those things that, I mean, this is a sci-fi podcast, but we'll get onto superheroes a little bit. But it's something that, like you say, because the biggest blockbusters at the moment are the superhero ones, and it's become a thing that, like you say, to completely avoid that level of sort of engagement with the impact on humanity. I mean, they had the whole it's like 40 bloody minutes of Man of Steel, of Superman and Zod destroying Metropolis. And and then when that sort of people rebelled against that, and we're like, yeah, you basically had him leveling the hero leveling a city, and didn't address the human impact. And so they did try to address it in the next film, but they handled it, in my opinion, very, very poorly. Mm-hmm. And so instead of trying to sort of go, yeah, this is going to happen, and these are the consequences, and we have to deal with this on a human level and this other stuff, they sort of paint it in the usual heroic disaster fashion of, we will carry on and, stiff upper lip if it's British or whatever. And then by the end of it, they're like, and this is for all of the heroes as well. Right, well, by the end of the film, we can't do that again, so we're going to find a deserted island off the coast of Metropolis, and we'll have our fight there. And it's the same every time. Like you said, Endgame, Avengers Endgame was exactly the same. It's sort of, you're going to have this massive, epic sort of battle between these great superheroes and these space villains and Thanos and his army. Where are we going to have it? Well, he's going to destroy the Avengers compound, which we have quite clearly established is out of the way of everybody else. So it's almost, instead of they don't want us to think about it anymore. They want it to be detached. They want it to be a separate thing. There's no, I think that's the thing now, to the extent of even the last time they tried to do it was a little bit, I suppose, was the first Avengers film. But then ever since then, there haven't been any sort of human, I suppose they did it again a little bit in Age of Ultron, but the enemies, they'll have robots, they'll have aliens, they'll have mutants, we can kill and we can destroy and we can do all this other stuff because the impact is minimal, because it's not human. And they just don't want you to think about it anymore. And I think it's a shame, because it should be a part of the conversation, really.
Yeah, and I agree completely. And I think that when you look at, when you look at what effect that has, right? I mean, what we're being sold on is we're being sold on the joy of violence, right? We're being sold on action. And I think there's nothing wrong with the joy of violence. I don't think there's anything wrong with loving, Godzilla setting Tokyo on fire. I mean, in the same way, I don't think there's anything wrong with an alien invasion movie where you see, cities being destroyed. It's okay to thrill at that. But I think that at the same time, it's so important to not lose sight of, not sanitize violence. I am so upset every time I see, I think you're entirely right in everything that you've said. But to go one step further and think about every action movie in which, people are just running through and they're shooting guys and, guys just, they get shot and they're just dead, right? They fall down the stairs. They're just dead. They don't lie there. The reality is it is really hard to kill somebody with a knife. It's almost impossible. I mean, you really have to have somebody on the ground and slit their throat. It's messy. It's terrible. You don't just stab somebody in the stomach. They lie there in pain for hours. When you're shot, you don't normally just die. Your bowels loosen. Your body makes noise. You're in pain. You're in agony. Imagine if, every time Tom Cruise ran through a corridor blissfully shooting people, you saw them in agony against the wall, just, in terrible pain. It smells, it's ugly. EMTs have to come in and be traumatized. Like, look at this site. There are all these dead people. Half of them are still alive and are probably going to die. Sanitizing all of this makes violence something that is not just enjoyable, which I think, is a part of fiction, maybe a part of the human brain. I can live with that. But to sanitize it makes it easy for us to dehumanize and depersonalize the victims of violence and to accept violence as something normative and also acceptable to inflict upon our fellow citizens and foreign countries. And I think to get back to Godzilla, if those movies make it, acceptable, in my country to say, well, a kid was shot by the police. That's sad, but, he's dead. That's a thing that happens. Well, we've invaded, a country. There's, 100,000 or 500,000 dead Iraqis due to that invasion. Well, that's a number, right? Those aren't, people like you see suffering in Godzilla. And I think you can make those calls. I mean, you can decide whatever you want to think about, police or about any given war. But you should not pretend that there isn't a remainder, right? You should not pretend that there aren't kids who aren't going to have a parent.
I think, and that's it. I think, every now and then these things are addressed. In a film will come along and, you see the reality, or as much reality as can be tolerated in a film, or the censors will allow. Springing to mind, I'm thinking of the first sort of, the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, or something. I'm going to a bit of a Spielberg thing, but thinking like Schindler's List, or there's been other films that have addressed this thing of sort of like, like you say, you can't just shoot someone and they fall over and it's dead. It's not like, a computer game. And you do, when you do see that, you do sort of go, yeah, that's horrific. And it really does sort of hit home. That level of violence is required to really take the human body apart. But to see the suffering, and it's, they say, but again, it's that thing of taking it off the battlefield and seeing it and saying, actually, this is how this can impact on people. If you think about sort of like, the other thing as well, from a Godzilla point of view, is if you were to be, I don't know where therapy was sort of in the 50s. It probably wasn't as recognized, or definitely wasn't as recognized as it was now. But like, as a nation, as a bunch of kids, not only have you seen this devastation of your city, you now know, and granted, one of them's been killed, right? But you would then live in fear for the rest of your life. Like, are you going to go swimming? I'm not. Are you kidding? Going swimming? Have you seen some of the monsters that live in that city? No. Like, this thing would devastate you psychologically. Like, you now know that a 150-foot monster lives in the sea. It's just. I can imagine it's like, the real consequences, and they're the things that are never really addressed, are they? They sort of, or if they do, they sort of touch on it, and then all of a sudden the character's fine 20 minutes later. They can't sleep, or they've taken up drinking, or they got their handshakes, or there's some sort of trope that will be introduced to show, they're on the edge, they really are suffering from something in the past. How's that going to impact them in the finale? Oh, it won't. I wouldn't worry about it.
It won't be mentioned, right? I mean, well, it's like a TV show. There's always that like one episode immediately after the like abduction and torture of a character where it's like, I'm pretty shaken up by that. Like, you were abducted and tortured. Like, you were going to go through lifelong PTSD and therapy about this. No, there's just going to be like one episode where it's mentioned and then never going to be mentioned again. Like, I'm past that. I moved past that, dude. Why are you still worried about it? Why are you still in therapy? This is not a good thing to be telling men, by the way.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely agree. And one of the things I feel is a shame about this film is a trope of films of this era is it just ends. You know, they defeat
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Godzilla, and then they're like, it ends. And that isn't to say that isn't a sort of that's just a trope. That's just the way these films are constructed in the sort of the 40s and the 50s. It's just a thing. But it would have been nicer to have almost like even a couple of minutes of an epilogue of we've defeated this.
Mm-hmm.
Now we've got to just survey what do we do next. And
Well, there's just that little bit where the Emiko scientist's father says Godzilla wasn't the last of the species, and there's this kind of like warning against nuclear tests. Like, if we do that, we might awaken another Godzilla. So there's a slightly heavy-handed kind of little thing there, but yeah, there's no follow-up on like the massive Tokyo reconstruction project that's about to occur.
And maybe that's a different kind of film full of like people in boardrooms who agree, budgets and contracts for construction companies and all that kind of stuff. That's a very different film. I'm not too interested in seeing, but it's just a thing of this era. But yeah, I have to admit, sort of one of the things, just as a final sort of point, really is. This is the origin film. I don't think there's any franchise I can think of. I mean, granted, this has got, like you said, this suffers because it's got so many films. But watching those ones from the 50s, that's sort of the show era, or the whatever era the first one was, that changes so quickly. Because this is a statement film. This film is about something. It has heart. It has a real thing to say. You can discuss it in its the context of its time and all this other stuff. To becoming basically big monsters kicking the crap out of each other, in the background of a human subplot. Like the next story, he goes up against, I think it's Gigan, and then you have, like you say, within a decade, you've got Mecha Godzilla, you've got a robot version of Godzilla. You've got films where he's doing, in the 60s, like literally within a decade, you have Godzilla dancing. You have him up with I think it's this Ultraman, and like, how did this change so quickly to become something that's so different? I just find that, having watched this film, I find it very, very bizarre. I don't know.
Yeah, well, you know more about that evolution than I do in terms of Godzilla's history, and how quickly it changed. But I do think of like say superheroes, right? You read like early Superman stuff. He's a social crusader. He is beating up men who commit domestic violence. He doesn't want anything to do with the cops. I mean, yes, he has superpowers, but it's very grounded in, not just real life, but actually social justice issues and, the society at the time and some of the ills at the time. Within a decade, right, he's flying around, with a pet, with crypto, and clearly it's about something else. And I think that when we look at these genres and how they began, there wasn't a genre yet, right? I mean, there wasn't a kaiju genre yet. And I think that, there wasn't a superhero genre yet. And so I think that my theory is that what happens is that the first films or the first comics or whatever that establish a genre, they have to establish it within the parameters of what we already have, right? So they have to like ease you into it. It has to be like a solid monster movie, about something. And then the creators kind of realize like, kids like seeing guys fly around and punch things, like the audience likes seeing a guy in a rubber suit, devastating Tokyo and it's burning. And it's like, that's what they want, dude. Like tone down this social message stuff. I just want to see the carnage. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with that per se, but it does sort of lend itself to exactly what you're describing, where, why not have a Mecha Godzilla,
Yeah, that's true. I suppose it's always supposed to be entertainment. I suppose at its core, that's what it's for. But it definitely feels like a bit of a shift. And that's not, it's not a bad thing. Those films have some merit in some ways. I'm not a huge fan of them all. But yeah, it is definitely an interesting one. But I suppose we sort of run out then. So, final thoughts then on Godzilla, 1954's Godzilla. Final thoughts then, Julian.
I love this movie. This movie is going to get a decently high rating from me, and I am really thankful that you forced me to watch it. And I didn't even know that I hadn't seen it because I kind of grew up with Godzilla, and I thought, well, I'm sure at some point this was played, and I watched this and they kind of all blend together. But, structurally, it's a little bit of a mess. I mean, thematically, we can kind of take it apart, but it is a solid monster movie. And I think that, what you were saying about the difference between the later installments and this one's trying to be a real movie. This one is forced to be a real movie because there isn't that genre yet. And it is beautiful. It's humanitarian. It's entertaining. And I often find myself enjoying some of these older, versions. Recently, that I watched the most recent Godzilla, the King of Monsters, and just did not like it. And I thought, I don't know what that costs, right? I mean, that cost $200 million or something to make. What did this one cost? I mean, what did the 1954 one? And it's so much better. And it's a little sloppy here and there, but so is the new one. You think for $200 million you could straighten out a plot that has as many problems, if not more, than this does. But this is such a better movie. It's charming, it's beautiful, and it has these wonderful scenes that stick with you. So I really thank you for, doing this and making me watch
I'm glad we're starting off strong, which is good. No, I'm the same. It's an interesting one, going back. I think, as you say, sort of everyone has an image of what Godzilla is. Probably more so now since the more recent incarnations of from Hollywood. And I think if you're going to watch those and stuff, I think there's, if you can find this, go and watch it. It's important that you do. You see where this originated from, where it came from. But more than that, this is, as I said, is a good film. It's, it's to say, pacing's not great. It's structurally, it's a little bit of a mess. But overall, it's a really, really good film. I enjoy it. I think the characters are good. I think it's trying to convey a message, that's important. And it has heart. And the one thing I would highlight, and sort of point out is it is definitely of its time. The special effects are of their time. And the acting is of its time. Acting has evolved and changed over time. And so if you know what to expect from sort of 50s films, then you're going to enjoy this. I agree. I really enjoyed going back to this. So, good start to season 2.
I did want to say something about what you just raised about the special effects, that I find myself utterly charmed by the special effects in this. And, there are times where you see, okay, that's a suit. Yeah. That's clearly a model there, right? But then there are other times, okay, you've added a glow to the celluloid, I mean, you can see how it's done, but there's so much that does work. I think one of the weakest things is when you see Godzilla's eyes, where there's a shot and it looks like such a cartoon. But I don't know why I find it. I'm so accepting of this, and I find it so difficult to accept a lot of CG that I think it's 99% there. But I'm just annoyed by how glossy it looks. I'm annoyed by, you're not showing the whole Godzilla, right? You're showing these close-up shots because it's easier to render and make it look, believable. Whereas in this, in earlier movies, I often think, I know you're conveying an idea, but you've conveyed it successfully, and I'm willing to go with it in a way that I'm not. I
honestly think that's a part of it, is the acceptance. I mean, because I love miniatures. When you see them in films, I think. All the way well into the 80s and 90s. If you see things like we said about devastation, and you see cars tumbling across, and it's clearly like a Hot Wheels. Like I love all that stuff. I think they look great. But again, especially the miniatures in this look good. Yeah, and like you say, there is a couple of moments where the guy in a suit looks and moves like a guy in a suit. But I don't know what it is. I'm more willing to. I just charming is definitely the word. I just like seeing this stuff. I mean, I'm a bit of a nerd for like Harryhausen, the stop motion stuff. I love all that stuff. I think it looks great. It doesn't look great. That's probably the problem. It doesn't look great, but I just love seeing it. I think it's such I think there's a mastery to it as well that I think, I'm sure there's a skill to doing CGI stuff with a computer. But when I see special effects, because there's some stop motion in this as well. But when you've got to have built a miniature, someone's had to have built a miniature, done the perspective right, added all the details and all sorts of stuff, and then you're going to blow it up. And you're sort of like, oh, that must be so gutting. You put all that work into that. You get one shot at it. So, yeah, I do. I don't know. I do kind of enjoy that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And for me, the CG, that is the best is the one that you don't notice, right? I mean, it's the scenes where you only learn later, oh yeah, that was digitally enhanced in this way or another. If you're conscious of it, then it's just another kind of miniature, right? You're now conscious, oh, that's a miniature. Oh, that's a CG shot, right? That leprechaun dude is not really there in the scene, right? And then I'm thinking like, oh, how did they do this? That actor's talking to a green screen. And ultimately, if you're conscious of it, it's the idea of a leprechaun, right? It might be a more convincing visual depiction of one, but it's still the idea of there's a Godzilla there, there's a leprechaun, there's a whatever. If you admit that, then what's the difference between that and a miniature that conveys, okay, here's this idea, it's really enough, or, Ray Harryhausen, who I also love, like, there's a kind of thrill to saying, first of all, how they did it, but also secondly, like, yeah, I get it. There's a leprechaun guy there. If it's not going to be 100% invisible, why make it that close?
No, I agree. And I think it'll be interesting because we're starting the series with this from 1954 with these very sort of basic, very sort of physical guy in suit and stop motion animation kind of special effects. And the end of this series with Valerian in the City of a Thousand Planets is incredibly CGI heavy for obvious reasons. So I think that'd be something to consider when we get there, is sort of like, okay, so, how does that fit in that thing across almost 60 years of filmmaking? So I think that'd be an interesting point to look at as well, actually. But we're not out of those old times yet. You're going to see some more oldies, worldy special effects on the next episode. Another film you haven't seen yet.
Yes,
the Hammer. It's not a horror. I suppose it could be sci-fi horror, but it's a Hammer Studios production from the 1960s. Quatermass and the Pit, and I love this film. I absolutely love it. Charming is one of those words, but this is something about this film that I just love, and so I cannot wait to see what you think of this. Even if you may tear it to pieces, because it has its flaws, but I really enjoy this film, so I can't wait to see what you got to say about it.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. I'm glad you're making me watch it, for better or worse. And I'm a huge Hammer horror fan. I mean, I've seen, back in the days when you had to go to, to video stores and track down the tapes and stuff. I would go to, a weird video store out in the middle of nowhere where they just had all these like oversized, the old oversized plastic VHS boxes of like all the Hammer horror stuff. And I'd be like, I don't know where this one occurs in the series, but I'm getting these three. So I kind of like track that stuff down and love that stuff. But Quatermass was never. Yeah,
there's going to be there'll be a bit of a history lesson around Quatermass as well, because he's almost like a lost British sci-fi icon, and this is sort of part, I would say, the pinnacle of that. because I don't know if you've heard of there's like the Quatermass experiment, and then there's X from the Unknown, and all these other things that sort of were done. So, but this is a great film. I'm really looking forward to it. So, so on the next episode, we are going to be doing Quatermass and the Pit, the Hammer Studios production, which I'm really looking forward to. But Julian, as always, it's been an absolute blast. This has been great. We did it on video. So if this has worked, and I've downloaded it correctly, this will be on YouTube at the same time we release the podcast. And check us out. Leave some comments below. I'm going to be doing these kinds of things because, I'll point to this. Comments below, ring the bell, subscribe. If you want to sort of hear more, see more, let us know what you think. And to the podcasters, if they're here somewhere, click whatever
like.
It is, right. These things down here, click on those. And for those listening to the podcast, go check out the YouTube because you can see our faces. But also, obviously, subscribe, leave a review, let us know what you think, and interact with us. We are on Twitter at PodTimeSpace. What are your thoughts on the Godzilla franchise? Have you seen this original? What are your thoughts on the modern takes? Has it lost its way? Is it still great? Do you like the devastation and the special effects? But in the meantime, Julian, thank you very much. And
thank you, Scott. It's an honor.
Catch up next time. There we go. Yes.